The night had been long, restless, and filled with the groaning of stone. Torches smoldered upon the ramparts, their flames gnawed thin by a wind that blew from the plain. Below, beyond the shadow of the ancient Theodosian walls, the Ottoman host stretched wide as a sea under moonlight, thousands of tents. Thousands of fires, their embers glowing red against the black earth. Through hours of darkness, the defenders had watched those fires, counting them as men once counted stars, until they lost all sense of number and only knew vastness. Then at last, the sky softened. First gray, then faint rose bled upon horizon, and dawn crept slow into city and camp alike.
Oh.
The fires of the besiegers died to smoke. Light came silence, the kind of silence that weighs heavy, broken only by the creak of armor and the cawing of crows. Upon the walls, men stood gaunt. From nights without sleep, their eyes were ringed with black, their lips cracked, their hands blistered from hauling stone and timber to mend what cannon had torn. They leaned upon spears, upon shields, upon faith. Some whispered prayers beneath breath, tracing crosses. In air, others stared blankly outward, hollow as statues they had mended through darkness. Knowing the light would bring fresh ruin, from the camp of the Sultan, banners stirred in dawn wind. Red with crescent, gold with script, black with symbols. Of war, they rose upon tall poles planted deep in earth. Between them, the giant cannon squatted, iron mouths black and gaping, their frames braced with chains. Even in stillness, they seemed to breathe menace, their bulk steaming faintly with dew. Men moved among them like ants upon beasts, preparing for day's thunder. The bells of Hagia Sophia rang out, their deep voices rolling across city, across sea, across plain. The sound was mournful, weighty, yet also defiant. It struck against silence, against the enemy's numbers, against despair itself. Women knelt in narrow lanes, children clasped hands, priests lifted icons. The whole city seemed to breathe, the bells, as if to remind walls that they were not alone, as if to remind heaven that they still believed. From the northern towers, the sea was visible waters of the Golden Horn, still and pale beneath dawn. Chains stretched across harbor mouth glimmered with dew, a line of iron holding back Ottoman ships that floated restless, their masts sharp against lightning sky. Seabirds wheeled above, their cries mingling with clang of bells and groan of stone. The emperor himself walked upon ramparts. Constantine XI, last of Byzantium, wore no crown. His armor was plain, his cloak simple, yet his bearing carried weight of empire. He moved among soldiers with words few and steady, his hand upon shoulders, his eyes upon horizon. He saw the cracks in stone, the fear in men, the endless camp beyond. Yet he did not falter. He was emperor of ruin, but still emperor, and his duty was to stand. The sun broke at last, spilling pale gold across dome of Hagia Sophia, across waters of Bosphorus, across banners of enemy. The light revealed all, the fissures in walls, the gauntness of people, the immensity of host. It revealed also courage, quiet but unbroken, upon faces of men who stood knowing they would fall. Thus dawn came upon Constantinople, not with promise of life, but with certainty of struggle. The walls, scarred and ancient, bore witness to light. They would see for last time. The city itself, jewel of empire, breathed deep and held fast. While beyond its stones, thunder waited to speak. The day of fate had begun. The city awoke with reluctance, as though it knew that the day it opened its eyes too would be its last. Light seeped through narrow windows of timber and stone, glancing off mosaics faded with time, sliding across alleys littered with dust and rubble, shaken loose from the night's cannon fire in the marketplace. Silence reigned where once the cries of traders had rung. Stalls stood skeletal, their awnings torn, their tables bare. A few merchants lingered still, their wares pitiful crumbs of bread hardened like stone. Jars of oil scraped nearly empty, fish salted long ago until their flesh had turned to leather. Money had lost its power. Gold weighed heavy in pockets, but bought little more than pity. Mothers bartered with heirlooms, offering rings, embroidered cloths, cherished icons, for a scrap of food. The tradesmen shook their heads, their eyes filled with sorrow, for they too had children hungry at home. Through the narrow streets shuffled the weary citizens of Byzantium. They moved as shadows, stooped beneath invisible burdens. Women filled jars at the fountains, their arms trembling with effort, whispering hurried prayers over each drop lest it be the last. Men carried timbers upon their shoulders, not to build, but to shore up cracks in walls and to patch shattered gates. Their faces bore no arrogance of craftsmen but grim determination of mourners. Children clung to mothers' skirts, their laughter long since stolen. They did not chase each other in play, but crouched by doorways, listening with wide, unblinking eyes. Some hummed snatches of hymns, songs they had heard in church, their small voices trembling. Others played games grimly, prophetic. They stacked pebbles for walls, toppled them with fists, or dragged rags tied in knots, pretending they were bodies borne upon carts. Innocence had withered in shadow of cannon. The churches were full. Hagia Sophia's vast dome loomed over all, its golden skin dimmed by smoke, yet still it gleamed in dawnlight. Within, the faithful gathered by thousands, kneeling upon cold marble, their foreheads pressed to stone worn smooth by generations. Priests in faded vestments, lifted icons kissed bare by centuries, swung censers heavy with incense. The air trembled. With prayer, the mingling of Greek and Latin voices, of hymns rising into vastness of dome, echoing back as if heaven itself sighed. Asterisk elsewhere. Smaller chapels swelled with songs. In one, a monk's voice broke mid-psalm, yet still he sang, his tears falling upon pages of manuscript he had copied with care. In another, old women lit candles until their trembling hands failed and wax dripped like blood upon floor. In yet another, children were baptized hastily, their parents desperate to seal them with grace before fate sealed them with death. The emperor was seen moving through streets, clad in armor simple but polished. Constantine XI did not ride, but walked among his people. He entered a bakery where ovens stood cold, speaking softly to the baker who wept with empty hands. He paused by a well where women drew water, blessing them with hand upon brow. He stepped into chapels, kneeling with monks, his lips moving in prayer as theirs did, was not distant, not aloof. He was one of them, and in his presence they found strength, though it was strength born of sorrow. In the palace, servants moved with quiet urgency. Tapestries once hung in splendor were now ragged, their colors dulled. The halls echoed with footsteps, not laughter, not music. Guards stood at doors, weary, armor dented, their eyes sharp yet tired. From balconies the sea stretched wide, blue and calm, mocking the turmoil within walls. Ships of the Genoese allies floated in harbor. Still, their sails furled, their decks silent, their fate bound to city's fate. As morning deepened, bells rang again. Their iron voices clashed with drums that rolled from enemy camp beyond walls. The sounds met in air above city, like two armies locked in battle even before men raised their swords. People paused, their hearts quickening, their breaths held. The bells rang for faith, for memory, for hope. The drums thundered for conquest, for hunger, for inevitability. Between them, Constantinople stood fragile as a candle between storms. And so the city awakened not to life, but to waiting. Not to hope, but to endurance. Its streets filled with shadows of people, its churches with cries of prayer, its walls with soldiers who watched horizon with hollow eyes. It breathed as a city condemned. Each moment heavy with knowledge that time was short, yet even as despair pressed, there lingered in corners sparks of defiance. A mother rocking her child too. Sleep with him on her lips. A boy drawing a crude cross upon dust of street. A soldier kissing icon before lifting his spear. Small, fragile, fleeting but sparks still. Sparks sometimes defy darkness longer than fire itself. Thus, Constantinople greeted its final morning. Not in splendor, not in triumph, but in weary courage that clung to faith, though fate loomed. Near, Beyond the towering walls, the world belonged not to the city, but to the camp of the Sultan. Dawn had revealed it in full. By mid-morning, the plain stretched from horizon to horizon like a vast ocean of men, banners, and steel. Where once fields had ripened with barley and vines, there now lay tents endless in number, fires smoldering, the glint of weapons catching sunlight like restless stars. The Ottomans had come in multitude, a living tide that no wall, however ancient, could wholly keep at bay. Drums beat slow and heavy, rolling like thunder across the earth, setting the rhythm of an empire's hunger. Trumpets brayed, shrill and sharp, their notes cutting through the smoke. Horses neighed, stamping, eager for war. The sound was not of chaos, but of order, and order built upon discipline, upon years of conquest, upon certainty that victory was close. At the heart of the camp stood the pavilion of Sultan Mehmed II, young yet already called the Conqueror. It was a tent of silk and gold, guarded by Janissaries in white turbans, their spears upright, their faces set in iron calm. Within, the Sultan moved with measured steps, speaking in low tones to his viziers and generals. His eyes were dark, fixed upon the city's walls and distance, his mouth firm with resolve. He was not merely a commander of men, but a man who believed himself chosen to end an age. Around him the camp labored ceaselessly. Engineers bent over plans drawn in dust, measuring distances to walls, calculating angles of fire. Blacksmiths hammered at anvils, sparks flying as they mended armor and sharpened blades. Servants hauled barrels of powder, sacks of grain, bundles of arrows. Muezzins climbed towers built of wood and cried the call to prayer, their voices rising and falling like waves, reminding all that faith walked beside steel. The multitude knelt as one, thousands upon thousands bending their foreheads to earth. Their whispers like the wind sweeping across grass, and always at the center of fear stood the cannons. They were monstrous, born of fire and iron, dragged for months across mountains and rivers. The greatest of them, cast by a master foundryman, was so vast that men said it devoured oxen whole when it was moved. Its barrel yawned black, wider than the shoulders of a man, its weight so great that the earth itself groaned beneath it. Round it teams of men labored, filling powder, hoisting stone balls heavier than men themselves, swabbing, ramming, binding. With chains, each blast was thunder, each stone a judgment hurled. The Janissaries drilled near the Sultan's tent, their ranks perfect, their steps measured. They were the flower of the army, boys taken in youth, raised in discipline, trained to fight without fear. Their faces betrayed nothing, neither pity nor hatred, only the cold focus of men who lived only for command. Their spears gleamed, their muskets rested upon shoulders, their blades flashed as they moved in unison. Two defenders upon wall, they seemed less men than machines of war. Beyond them stretched the irregular host, cavalry with banners streaming, tribesmen with curved swords, archers with quivers bulging, miners ready with picks to tunnel beneath the walls. Each nation of the empire had sent its share, and the plain rang with tongues of many lands. Yet all were bound by one voice, one will, one hunger. At night the camp was a city of fire. Thousands of torches blazed, their glow staining sky red. The drums beat long into darkness. Horns cried, voices lifted in chants. To the men upon Constantinople's walls, it was a living nightmare, a vision of hell spread wide and endless. Mothers hushed their children, whispering that the fires were stars fallen to earth. Yet even as they spoke, they knew the truth. The stars had not fallen, but death had risen, and still. Despite fear, the defenders gazed outward. They counted banners, they marked engines, they measured tunnels. They knew they were few, that no aid would come, that the walls cracked deeper with every blast. Yet they watched, not with surrender, but with grim resolve. For to turn eyes inward was to despair, and to look outward was to remember what they must hold. So the siege pressed, a circle tightening, a weight unyielding. The Ottomans roared and prayed, their numbers endless, their hunger sharp. The Byzantines prayed and labored, their numbers few, their courage fierce, Between them stood the walls old, scarred, trembling. Between them stood time itself, running. Out the morning deepened, and with it came the sound that had already haunted the city for weeks, the thunder of the cannons. At first, it was a low rumble, like distant storm rolling across unseen sky. Then the roar cracked open the earth, tearing silence apart. From the Ottoman lines, the monstrous bombards spoke, and their voices were deeper than thunder, longer than storm. Heavier than mountain falling, flame burst from iron mouths, thick smoke poured upward, the ground itself shook beneath each discharge. Stone shot, vast as millstones, screamed through air, a howl that curdled blood before it struck. And when it struck, walls trembled as though struck by fist of giant. Masonry cracked, mortar split, towers shuddered. Stones that had stood 1,000 years groaned, and in their groan men heard prophecy of ruin. Dust billowed high, rising like cloud of ash above ramparts. Men coughed, choked, their eyes stung. Some staggered blindly, clutching at ears that rang. With pain, others fell screaming, crushed by stones torn from battlements, hurled down upon them by their own walls. Shouts rang out, "Rebuild, shore the breach, bring earth, bring timber." And soldiers ran, hauling sacks, dragging beams, patching holes with desperation of drowning men, plugging leaks in ship already sunk to mast, from within the city. Each blast was a judgment. Roofs shook, windows rattled, tiles fell from domes. Women clutched children to breasts, rocking them though rocking could not drown thunder. Infants wailed, dogs howled, bells in small chapels rang, not from hand but from vibration. Dust drifted, down from rafters, falling upon food, upon beds, upon hair. It tasted bitter, acrid, like powder and death. Still the cannons roared. One after another, a chorus of iron. The greatest of them, the monstrous bombard cast by the Hungarian master, sent forth a stone that struck at tower by the gate. The tower shuddered, leaned, held, then stones spilled like sand from vessel cracked. Men cried out, rushing to brace, while beneath them enemy soldiers cheered, their voices rolling like wave. From the Ottoman camp came drums, horns, cries of triumph. Each blast was greeted with chant of Allahu Akbar that rolled across plain, over walls, into city itself. It mingled with cries of women, with sobs of children, with shouts of defenders. It filled air so thick that silence seemed banished forever. Yet even as walls bled dust and stones, men stood firm. The emperor was seen upon ramparts, his cloak torn, his armor dusted with lime. He raised sword above head, shouting words none could hear above thunder. Yet all saw his lips move, all saw his hand raised, and courage sparked again. Soldiers lifted shields, lifted spears, lifted voices in hoarse cries of defiance. Priests moved among them, carrying icons, holding crosses high. They blessed men who labored, kissed brows of dying, traced signs in air over breaches. Their chants rose thin, fragile against roar, yet still they rose, defying thunder with prayer. One priest, struck by falling stone, fell bleeding, yet his hand still clutched cross. His lips still moved. In Hagia Sophia, bells rang louder, as if to drown cannon's voice. Hymns filled nave, rising to dome vast, echoing until stone itself seemed to sing. The faithful knelt, tears streaming, their voices trembling yet unbroken. They prayed not that walls would stand, for they heard their groans, but that souls within would be spared, that heaven would receive them when stones fell. At last, the city itself seemed alive, crying with each blast. Its walls moaned, its towers shook, its domes shuddered. Dust and flame veiled its beauty, but still it stood, scarred yet unfallen. Each blast tore peace away, yet still it stood. Each cheer of enemy proclaimed victory, yet still it stood. And so day burned on, with thunder unceasing. Smoke darkened. Sun, dust-veiled sky, cries filled air. Men fought stone with stone, timber with timber, faith with fear. And the empire, old and weary, held breath between blasts, waiting, enduring. Trembling upon edge of abyss, the thunder did not cease. It would not cease. It was voice of new age, voice of empire rising, voice of empire dying. It was sound of world breaking, and Constantinople trembled beneath it. The roar of the cannons did not fade, yet within the city rose another sound, one softer, older, and more fragile, the echoes of prayer. Hagia Sophia loomed above all, its dome touched with smoke and dust, its golden skin dulled by shadow. Yet, inside, light trembled from 1,000 candles, their flames bending as if shivering in fear, their glow weaving across mosaics worn by centuries. Christ looked down from high vault, his eyes somber. The Virgin bowed her head, saints stretched, their hands in blessing that seemed heavy with sorrow. The air swelled with incense, thick as fog, mingling with dust that fell like ashes shaken loose by each bombard's strike. Thousands knelt upon cold marble. Rich and poor alike pressed their foreheads to stone worn smooth by generations of knees. Children clung to mothers, their lips moving in imitation of prayers they did not fully know. Old men trembled, their voices cracked, their rosaries clattered in hands weak but unyielding. Women whispered Ave Marias through tears, some holding infants swaddled against breast, others clutching nothing, their arms empty from loss already. Tasted, priests moved among them in robes faded by time, chanting psalms in voices weary yet unbroken. They swung censers, smoke curling upward in pale ribbons as though to bind heaven closer. One priest stood at great altar, his arms lifted, his voice steady, though his eyes glistened. Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. The crowd echoed, Lord have mercy, their words rolling like tide, filling nave vast until even stones seemed to murmur them. From galleries above, monks sang hymns. Their voices rose in Greek, solemn and deep, weaving with chants of priests, and murmurs of people into single great sound. It was not song of triumph but of lament, not of victory but of supplication. It trembled like thread fraying, yet held binding together hearts too weary to stand alone. Outside the cannons roared, again shaking the ground, rattling dome, toppling dust from mosaics. Yet within, the prayers did not falter. They rose louder, as if to challenge thunder with whisper, as if to hurl faith against iron. The people knew walls might fall, yet they prayed still, for prayer was the last fortress when stone cracked and steel shattered. Beyond Hagia Sophia, in smaller chapels scattered through city, the same sound grew. In one, a mother brought her child to baptismal font, the water trembling from cannon's thunder. The priest poured, whispered words ancient, traced cross upon brow tiny and pale. The child wailed, and mother wept, but her tears were of relief, for though city might fall, soul was sealed in grace eternal. In another, nuns knelt in cloisters, their hands folded, their lips whispering psalms until voices failed. Some sang until breath fled, collapsing upon cold flagstones, yet their lips moved still. In their eyes burned not fear, but surrendered not to enemy but to God. Upon ramparts, too, prayers rose. Soldiers kissed icons tied to armor, crossed themselves. Before lifting spears, some prayed aloud, calling upon saints to guard wives, children, fathers far below. Others muttered silent words, their eyes fixed upon horizon, their faith hidden but fierce. In dust and blood, they prayed as they fought, each blow struck with plea unspoken, each wound borne with him unvote. As day lengthened, prayers echoed louder. They poured through alleys, from open windows, from chapels and domes. They mingled with sobs, with coughs, with cries, until city itself seemed to hum with single vast supplication. It was not harmony, but cacophony, not triumph, but lament. Yet it was stronger than silence, braver than despair. And in that chorus, fragile Constantinople endured. The walls might bleed, the towers might groan, the gates might splinter, but faith whispered still, rose still, defied still. The cannons roared, the drums thundered, the enemy cried conquest. Yet within the city of Constantine, prayers echoed, soft and ceaseless. carrying voices of thousands heavenward, and perhaps in heaven. The angels wept to hear them. The bells of Hagia Sophia still trembled in the distance, their echoes riding over roofs like faint breath of hope. But by noon, the city shook with another rhythm, the crash of iron against stone, the clatter of arrows, the roars of men in combat. The thunder of the cannons had weakened the ancient walls, and now the Ottomans hurled themselves upon them with fury of sea breaking against cliffs. The sun hung high, its light veiled by smoke and dust. The air burned with heat, with sweat, with the stench of powder. Shadows of ladders rose upon ramparts, thrown up by swarms of soldiers clambering like ants. Janissaries in white turbans, their armor gleaming, moved in disciplined ranks, their shields locking as they surged. Behind them came hosts of irregular warriorsmen from distant lands, shouting in tongues the Byzantines barely knew, each carrying sword or axe or bow. The plain roared with their cries, with drums, with horns, with voices promising conquest. Upon the walls, the defenders braced. They were few, worn, gaunt, yet they met storm with desperation sharpened into courage. Stones rained down from parapets, smashing upon helmets, crushing men who fell screaming. Cauldrons of boiling water and oil were hurled, scalding those who climbed. Arrows hissed from Genoese bowstrings, bolts sang from crossbows, and spears thrust downward into massive flesh. Blood-spattered stone, slickening ladders, staining hands. But still they came, hands grasped at battlements, helmets rose, blades flashed, shouts met shouts, steel struck steel. The clash rang across ramparts, filling air with shriek of iron. With grunts of men locked close, a soldier of Constantinople drove spear through chest of invader, only to be cut down by axe that split helm in two. A Genoese mercenary, his mail torn, swung sword in wide arc, felling three before arrow pierced his throat and he fell choking, eyes wide, blood bubbling, amidst smoke and dust. The emperor himself strode. Constantine XI moved with blade drawn, his cloak tattered, his face blackened by soot, but his voice clear. "Hold," he cried, "for the city, for faith, for your children." His words rang as thunder rang, his figure shone like beacon through haze. Men steadied, lifted shields, struck harder. Even as they fell, they rose again in spirit, their courage bound to emperor, who fought not in palace, but upon wall beside them. The sun beat down, turning armor to fire, sweat to salt. The wounded groaned, clutching guts, clutching limbs shattered by stones. They were carried down ladders into streets below, where women bound wounds with cloth torn from their own garments, where priests whispered prayers into ears already deafened by pain. Children carried water in jars too heavy for their arms, stumbling as they climbed, pouring upon parched lips of soldiers who drank between cries of battle. Yet the enemy did not relent. Their horns blared, their drums pounded, their chants filled sky. For every man who fell, another surged forward. The ladders multiplied, rising like forest, their tops bristling with helmets and blades. Arrows darkened sky, falling and hissing. Rain? Some struck shields, some struck flesh, some buried in timber with thud that shook arms of defenders. The Janissaries advanced, relentless. Their shields held high, their formation tight. They climbed where others faltered, their discipline carrying them where courage alone had failed. They reached parapets, their curved blades flashing. Men fell before them, their cries drowned in clash of steel. For a moment the walls shook. The line wavered. Then Constantine rushed, his sword flashing, his guards around him. They struck hard, their cries fierce, and Janissaries fell back, tumbling down ladders broken beneath weight. Cheers rose from defenders, ragged yet fierce, their voices carrying down into city like bomb upon despair. But the cheers were brief, for the cannons roared again, their stones striking lower walls. Earth shook, dust rose, towers cracked. More ladders came, more men surged, more drums thundered. Noon burned with struggle unceasing, with cries unending, with blood unmeasured. The city groaned, its walls bled, its people prayed. Above all, the sun shone, pitiless and bright, casting its light upon struggle, fierce and endless. It shone upon men who fought, upon men who fell, upon walls that trembled, upon city that endured. It was witness impartial, watching empire bleed its last beneath its gaze. Thus noon passed in struggle, in thunder, in prayer, in cries. The walls still stood, but they trembled. The defenders still fought, but they weakened. The enemy still surged, but they bled. Balance hung fragile, swaying with each blast, with each strike, with each cry, and all knew the day was far from done. And shadows yet deeper waited before night. The noon sun was merciless. It blazed upon helmets, upon mail, upon shields dented and cracked. It scorched the rubble that filled breaches, glared upon pools of blood, blackening in heat. Yet on the northern stretches of the Theodosian walls, where the fighting pressed most fierce, there was still movement, still defiance. There Greeks and Genoese stood shoulder to shoulder, bound not by blood but by fate. The Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, tall and broad, clad in mail that gleamed even through dust, moved with steady purpose. His sword was heavy in hand, but his voice was steady. "Clear, stand fast," he cried in Italian, and his men answered in harsh chorus. "Hold with us," he shouted in broken Greek, and the Byzantines lifted their shields, their hearts steadied by his fire. The Genoese had come across the sea, mercenaries bound by oath and coin, yet they fought now as if bound by something greater. Their crossbow bolts sang death into the mass below, their blades flashed, their shields locked against the surge of ladders. The Greeks beside them, farmers and craftsmen turned soldiers, lifted spears, hurled stones, thrust with pikes. By side they fought, their curses mingling, cries echoing as one. An Ottoman ladder rose against the wall, its top bristling with helmets. Die. The Genoese fired in volley, bolts striking throats, striking faces. Men toppled backward, dragging comrades down, the ladder shaking until it splintered upon earth. A cheer rose, ragged but fierce, from Greeks and Genoese alike. They clasped hands for heartbeat before lifting weapons once more for another ladder. Already rose in its place. Giustiniani moved swiftly along wall, where breaches cracked and stones fell. He directed repairs with voice iron, ordering sacks of earth to fill gaps, beams to brace towers. Men obeyed, sweating, bleeding, cursing. Yet working, Constantine himself came to him, their eyes meeting in moment of silent understanding. The emperor grasped his arm. "We stand together," Constantine said. Giustiniani bowed his head. "Together," he answered, and both returned to wall, for time allowed no more. Among the Greeks, courage grew. They had long looked upon their city with despair, seeing empire crumbled to shadow, its glory gone. Yet beside them now stood men from across the sea, men who did not bow to fear. Their defiance was flame, and Greeks caught spark. They fought harder, struck fiercer, their voices lifted louder. For a time the wall held, a line unbroken, a fortress of flesh and will. The Ottomans below surged again, their horns blaring, their drums thundering. Janissaries pressed forward, their shields gleaming, their voices chanting. They climbed ladders, they swarmed breaches, they struck with blades curved and sharp, but the wall did not fall. The Genoese met them with steel, the Greeks with spears, and together they hurled them back. Stones tumbled, oil boiled, arrows hissed, blood spilled. The clash rang like tempest, unending, merciless, yet cost was heavy. A Genoese captain fell, an arrow deep in his chest, his body tumbling backward from parapet. A Greek youth, scarcely beard upon his face, thrust spear into soldier's throat, only to be cleft from shoulder by axe. Men fell, one by one, yet others stepped into place, their hands seizing weapons, their feet planting firm upon blood-slick stone. The sun slid westward, shadows lengthened. The air was thick with smoke, with screams, with prayers. The Genoese and Greeks fought still, their strength waning, their courage burning bright. They stood not as two peoples, but as one line, one wall, one last defiance. And though they knew numbers vast pressed against them, Though they knew cannon still roared, though they knew fate itself stood against them, they held. Together they held, and in their unity, for brief time, the empire did not fall. The wall trembled, the stones cracked, but still it stood, and upon it Greeks and Genoese fought side by side. Shadows mingling in dusk of empire, the battle upon the walls raged. But within the city, another war was fought quieter, more desperate, more human. It was the war of hunger, of fear, of despair that crept into every narrow alley, every shuttered house, every heart that still beat within Constantinople's ancient stones. The streets were no longer streets of empire, but corridors of shadow. Dust drifted down from shaking walls, turning air gray. Smoke clung between houses where kitchens had burned the night before. The cries of wounded from ramparts echoed down lanes, mingling with sobs of women, with wails of children, with whispers of prayer. In corners where once merchants had spread silks and spices, now only silence crouched, broken by hurried footsteps and muffled cries. Families barred themselves within homes, timbers nailed across doors, windows shuttered with planks. From outside came sound of weeping, of coughing, of whispered prayers through cracks. Some voices rose high in plea, begging saints for mercy. Others muttered low, bargaining with God, promising fasts, penance, anything for deliverance. But the city itself gave no answer, only dust, only silence, in courtyards. Women knelt over buckets, drawing water from wells that echoed with emptiness. They hauled with trembling arms, knowing each drop might be last. Children crowded around, cups clutched in small hands, eyes wide with thirst. Some drank too quickly, choking. Others sipped slowly as though stretching time. Mothers hushed them, their own lips cracked, their own throats dry, yet they gave children water first, keeping silence over their own pain. Merchants sat before empty stalls, their scales useless, their purses heavy yet worthless. Gold could not conjure bread, silver could not buy oil. A man with a handful of coins begged for loaf, but baker shook his head, showing bare shelves. Coins clattered to cobbles, and man fell to knees, sobbing. The baker turned away, for his own children starved, his own heart broken. Orphans wandered alleys barefoot, their eyes hollow, their clothes torn. Some knocked at doors already barred, calling for mothers who would never answer. Others huddled together beneath arches, clutching each other against chill of fear. Their voices carried songs once sung in play, but now they faltered, breaking into sobs. Rats darted between them, bold, feeding upon refuse of houses abandoned. The streets grew stranger by hour. Shadows lengthened, though sun still burned above, for smoke and dust dimmed its light. Shapes moved in alleys, priests carrying icons to bless houses, women carrying water jugs heavy upon backs, soldiers limping from walls, blood trailing behind them. Some men carried bodies wrapped in cloth, silent, their faces blank. They passed through alleys with slow tread, laying their burdens in chapels already overflowing. The chapels themselves had become tombs. Bodies lined their floors, candles burning low beside them. Priests whispered prayers hoarse from endless repetition. Women wept until voices broke, then sat in silence, rocking back and forth. Children clutched icons, their fingers white around, wood-worn smooth by centuries. Hymns rose weakly, faltering, yet they rose still, clinging to heaven as stone and steel failed. Fear bred whispers, and whispers bred anger. In market squares, men muttered that some had betrayed them, that sins had doomed city, that wrath of heaven had been provoked. Some accused strangers, merchants from other lands, of bringing doom. Stones were thrown, curses spat. Man was dragged through streets, accused of sorcery, beaten until silence fell upon him. Yet when he lay still, the fear did not ease. It grew heavier, spreading from street to street, house to house. Children felt it most. They played games grim as prophecy, building walls of stones, toppling them with kicks, pretending to be soldiers, and shouting words they had heard, for the city, for Allah, for the Emperor. Their voices rang high, innocent yet tragic, for their games mirrored truth too closely. Others watched, their hearts torn, knowing some would not See, another dawn night came early and streets choked with dust. Lamps were lit, their light trembling upon walls scarred with cracks. Families gathered close, their whispers soft. Some sang hymns, their voices breaking. Others sat in silence, eyes fixed upon doors, listening to a roar of battle outside, waiting for a knock that might be death. And through it all, Hagia Sophia's dome loomed above, its shadow stretching over alleys, its bells tolling still. The sound was heavy, carrying prayers into night, mingling with sobs, with cries, with silence. The city lived within that sound, clinging to it, fearing it, knowing it might be last voice they would ever hear. Thus the streets of Constantinople bore witness not only to clash of armies, but to sorrow of people within. They bore witness to hunger, to despair, to anger, to prayer. They bore witness to shadows that crept deeper as day faded, as empire trembled, as fate drew near, and in those shadows hope flickered faint, fragile as candle flame in storm. The children of the city were the smallest voices, yet in those final days their whispers carried like echoes through hollow streets. They did not bear swords, they did not mend walls, they did not sit at council. But their eyes saw all, and their fear became the measure of Constantinople's last breath, in the shadow of Hagia Sophia. A group of children huddled near the steps where pigeons once gathered. The birds were gone now, scattered by smoke and roar of cannons. But the children still crouched, clutching scraps of bread hardened to stone. They passed pieces between them as treasure, licking fingers to savor what little taste remained. Boy no older than 10 cradled his sister in arms, thin as reeds. She whimpered with hunger, and he sang softly, a hymn he had heard from priests. Though his voice cracked and faltered, elsewhere in a narrow alley, children played a cruel game. They stacked stones high, calling them walls of Rome. With shouts they toppled them, kicking until rubble scattered. Then they raised sticks, crying out in voices shrill, "For the Sultan," others answered, "For the Emperor." The clash of wood echoed like parody of battle raging above. Their mothers watched from doorways, eyes hollow, lips pressed tight, unable to tell them to stop, for what else could children do but turn fear into play? Yet even as they played, tears streaked their cheeks, betraying truth their game could not hide. Some children wandered streets barefoot, seeking food. They peered into abandoned houses, lifting broken shutters, stepping carefully among dust and shattered icons. In one, a girl found a crust of bread hardened with mold. It in two, offering half to younger brother. He smiled weakly, his teeth small and broken, and they ate in silence. Outside, thunder of cannon shook earth, dust rained down, but they ate as though in palace, their eyes closed. Pretending feast, the orphans gathered by chapels, where priests gave them water, scraps of bread, whispered blessings. Some clutched icons carved from wood, small and rough, worn smooth by desperate hands. They held them as if they were mothers, as if saints carved in crude lines could shield them from fate. Their prayers were simple, stumbling, childlike. "Please save Mama. Please stop the noise." Their innocence pierced deeper than any wound, for it begged not for empire, not for city, but for tomorrow. In one home, a father lay dying, his body broken by plague and hunger. His son, barely 12, knelt beside him, holding cup of water, 2 lips that could no longer drink. Tears streamed down boy's face, but he did not cry aloud. He whispered, "I will be strong for Mama." The man's hand trembled, fell still. The boy kissed his forehead, then rose to comfort mother, who wept beside. Childhood ended in heartbeat, placed by weight of grief too heavy for small shoulders. The children gathered stories, though they did not know it. They whispered to one another what they had seen: towers cracking, soldiers bleeding, women wailing, priests praying until voices broke. They told these tales in corners, in hushed voices, eyes wide. Each story grew, becoming myth already, shaping their fear into something larger than themselves. Their words would outlive walls, for memory often hides in mouths of little ones. Night fell, and with it their fear deepened. The streets grew darker, lamps too few, shadows too long. Children clung to mothers, trembling at each roar of cannon, at each cheer of enemy camp. Some hid beneath tables, their hands over ears, their eyes squeezed shut. Others begged to be carried, though arms of parents were too weary. In darkened rooms, lullabies were sung, voices cracking, songs trembling, trying to wrap fear in blanket. Of love, a boy, older than most, stood upon roof with his father, watching walls in distance. Flames glowed, smoke curled, whispered, "Will they come tonight?" The father sighed, his eyes fixed upon horizon. "Perhaps tomorrow." The boy shivered, not from cold, but from knowledge that tomorrow always came. The children were too. Young to hold swords, too young to sit in council, too young to mend stones. Yet their fear was city's fear, their tears were city's tears. In their silence, in their whispers, in their trembling hands clutching crusts of bread. Constantinople revealed its soul, and though history would tell of emperors and sultans, of cannons and walls, the truth of that day lived also in eyes of children, eyes wide, filled with fear. Reflecting flames of empire's end, the thunder of the cannons did not cease, nor did the cries upon the walls. Yet within the city there was movement of another kind, the steady steps of an emperor who refused to hide. Constantine XI Paleologos, last of the Roman emperors, walked through his city like a man already crowned in martyrdom. He wore armor plain, polished but scarred, its steel dulled by dust and smoke. His cloak was torn at hem, his face lined with weariness, but his eyes were steady. And in their dark flame the people found reflection of their own courage. He did not ride a horse, nor march surrounded by trumpets. He walked among his people. As one of them, each step heavy with knowledge, yet lightened by resolve. Through narrow streets he passed, where families huddled in doorways, where children clung to mothers, where men sharpened knives though they knew they would never reach. The wall. At each door he paused, laying hand upon brow of a child, blessing him. To each woman he whispered words of comfort. "Be strong, pray. Heaven watches." To each man he clasped shoulders, gaze steady, saying only, "Stand with me." His voice was not loud, but it carried as if stone and air themselves bore it. Into hearts in the market square he stopped, where bread stalls stood bare, where men wept over coins useless as ash. He knelt beside them, took their hands, spoke of endurance. Gold may vanish, bread may crumble, but courage feeds the soul. Let us not let fear consume us before the enemy does. The words were simple, yet they steadied men who rose with tears upon cheeks, but with backs straighter. He entered chapels where priests prayed over bodies wrapped in linen, where women lit candles with trembling hands. He knelt among them, his forehead pressed to stone like theirs, his lips moving in same psalms. No crown separated him, no throne elevated him. He was as they were, a soul trembling before fate. When he arose, people reached to touch his hand. His cloak, even dust upon his boots, as though grace might pass into them through his presence. Children followed him in alleys, small voices calling, "Basileus! Basileus!" He turned, knelt, placed his hand upon their heads. "Do not fear," he told them. "Though shadows fall, light will rise again." They believed him, for children believe even when grown men cannot. Their eyes shone, and for a moment their fear dimmed, replaced by pride that emperor had spoken to them. At the great palace he paused, gazing upon halls once bright with music. Now dim, their marbles scarred, their tapestries frayed. He did not linger. He turned away, for his heart was with people, not with stone. He walked toward Hagia Sophia, its dome vast, its bells tolling. Entering, he knelt once more with thousands gathered, his armor glinting among humble garments. The sight moved many to tears, for Emperor of Rome knelt as brother among them, as son among them, as father among them. Then he rose and spoke. His words were not recorded in full, but they were remembered in hearts. He thanked Genoese, who had come across sea. He blessed Greeks who had stood upon walls. He begged forgiveness for faults of rulers past, and he swore that he would not flee. "I die with you," he said, and if God wills, I die for you." The words rolled through nave, through dome, through city itself, binding people in sorrow and in courage. When he left Hagia Sophia, the sun had begun its descent.
The shadows
Stretched long across streets, yet those who had seen him walked with firmer step. Mothers hushed children with gentler voices. Men sharpened knives not with despair but with grim resolve. Priests prayed louder, their voices strong. For Emperor had walked among them, and in him they saw not a king upon throne, but a man who would die as one of them. And so Constantine passed through his city, gathering courage where it flickered, fanning it into flame where it had dimmed. He was last of his line, last of his empire, last light of a world that had endured 1,000 years. He knew night would come, but he would not meet it upon gilded throne. He would meet it upon wall, sword in hand. Beside his people, the drums beat beyond gates. The cannons roared, the sun dipped lower. Within the city, for a little while, courage rose like echo of ancient Rome, stirred by footsteps of last emperor walking among his people. The sun slid westward, casting long beams of pale gold across the stones of the Theodosian walls. But what that light revealed was ruin. The thunder of the bombards had not ceased since dawn, and with each blast the walls groaned, their wounds widening, their strength bleeding away. Where once towers had stood firm and high, now they leaned like weary giants, their crowns shattered, their bodies cracked. At the gate of St. Romanus, the greatest of the cannons bellowed once more. Its iron mouth spat fire, its voice shook earth, and a stone vast as ox thundered forth. It struck the battered tower, and with a roar like mountain breaking, masonry exploded outward. Dust rose thick as storm, blotting sun, choking men. When it cleared, a fissure gaped wide, jagged and black, rubble piled at its base. The defenders groaned, for they knew no timber, no sack of earth could wholly mend such wound. Men swarmed. To repair, dragging beams, hauling stones, shoving earth into gaps. Their arms bled, their backs broke, their lungs burned with dust. Priests stood among them, blessing each handful of earth, each stone lifted, as though prayer might bind what mortar could not. Children carried buckets of sand, staggering under weight too great for their small bodies, yet refusing to stop. Women tore linen into strips, binding wounds of men crushed beneath falling rock. All labored, not as soldiers or civilians, but as city itself, striving to heal its body as it bled. Yet for every stone they set, another fell. The cannons roared again and again, their mouths belching smoke, their stones shrieking through air. Each strike tore fresh wound, each blast deepened cracks. The breaches grew, not small fissures, but gaping mouths, hungry to swallow invader. Dust-coated faces until all looked pale as corpses, their eyes red, their lips black with soot. From Ottoman camp rose cheers with every strike. Drums rolled, horns blared, voices cried out. They saw walls trembling, towers crumbling, gates splintering. They saw victory drawing near, closer with each stone hurled. Janissaries sharpened blades, tightened straps, readying for assault when breach yawned wide enough. Cavalry pawed earth, eager to ride into city long desired. The Sultan himself stood before his pavilion, watching with eyes dark and hungry. His hand resting upon sword, upon walls, Constantine appeared once more, his armor coated with dust, his cloak torn. He raised his sword, his voice ringing above thunder. "Hold," he cried. "This city has stood 1,000 years. It will stand." Today, his words carried, steadying men whose hands faltered. They shouted in answer, a ragged cheer, their voices hoarse yet fierce. They lifted spears, hurled stones, braced timbers. For Emperor stood with them, and as long as he stood, so did they. But even as courage flared, truth pressed heavy. Breaches grew. What had been scar became wound. What had been wound became chasm. The walls, once shield of empire, now stood as bones cracked and hollow, their marrow shaken loose. The defenders knew it. They felt tremor beneath their feet, heard groan of stone beneath their hands. They patched still, fought still, prayed still. But in their hearts they knew the walls could not endure forever. Evening shadows lengthened, stretching across rubble. Smoke curled upward, dimming sun, turning sky red as blood. The air tasted of ash, of fear, of despair unspoken. From breaches came whispers of wind, carrying voices of enemy camp chants, prayers, cries of triumph yet to come. The city shivered. Beneath those whispers, for they spoke not of if, but of when. Thus the breaches grew wide and unhealed, deep and unending. They were not merely wounds in stone, but wounds in hope. And though men still fought to mend, still prayed to heal, the city itself groaned. As if confessing what all already knew, the end pressed closer with each breath, with each blast, with each stone hurled, and night approached, carrying with it shadow heavier than stone, darker than dust, more certain than steel. The sun, weary in the sky, cast its last golden rays upon the field of war. They touched the tattered banners of Byzantium, trembling on the ramparts, and they gleamed upon the polished helms of the enemy camp. And then, as if answering the thunder of the cannons, there rose another sound, deep, terrifying, relentless, the cry of the Janissaries. It began low, a chant rolling like distant storm across plain, then it swelled, louder, sharper, until it filled the air with roar that shook even hearts behind walls. Allahu Akbar, they cried, thousands of voices joining as one, a tide of sound that swept across earth, across sky, crashing against ancient stone. Drums pounded with it, horns blared, cymbals clashed, until the very air quivered. The defenders upon ramparts felt their knees weaken, for this was no mere war cry, but the voice of empire itself, the breath of an army that believed heaven marched beside them. From the front ranks surged the Janissaries, the Sultan's chosen, his sword made flesh. They advanced in perfect order, their white turbans rising like crest of tide, their shields lifted, their blades gleaming. Their faces betrayed no fear, no hesitation, only cold resolve. They climbed ladders, their boots striking rungs in unison. Their chants unbroken, though arrows fell upon them, though stones crushed them, though oil scalded them. Where one fell, another rose. Where one ladder splintered, another was raised. Upon the wall, the Greeks and Genoese braced. Crossbows sang, arrows hissed, spears thrust down, stones crashed, ladders toppled, men fell screaming into dust below. Yet the Janissaries did not falter. They pressed closer, climbing still, their voices thundering, their blades flashing. Walls shook with clash of steel, with cries of men locked in combat. A Genoese captain struck down one invader, his sword biting deep, but a second surged behind, cleaving his helm in two. A Greek youth thrust spear into chest of climber, only to be dragged down into abyss by dying grasp. Men fell, rose, fought, bled, their cries mingling with thunder of enemy chant. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, strode along parapet, his voice fierce, his blade steady. "Stand! Hold the wall!" he cried, and his men rallied, pressing back wave that surged. Beside him, Constantine himself fought, his sword crimson, his shield battered. He struck like lion cornered, his eyes blazing with fire of man who knew. His end yet defied it. At sight of emperor upon wall, the soldiers roared, their voices hoarse, their courage renewed, but the Janissaries pressed still. Their discipline was iron, their faith unbroken. They fought not for plunder, not for coin, but for destiny. They believed themselves instruments of Sultan's will, and through him, of God's command. Their cries were hymns of conquest, their blades psalms of empire. They surged upon breaches torn by cannon, filling them with steel, forcing defenders back step by step. The clash became storm. Steel rang upon steel, shields splintered, arrows buried deep in flesh. Blood ran in rivulets, down stones dripping into earth below. The air was thick with dust, with smoke, with cries that drowned even thunder of bombards. The wall itself seemed alive, groaning beneath weight of struggle, trembling with fury of combat. As dusk approached, the fighting did not slacken. Torches flared, casting light upon helms, upon swords, upon faces grim and desperate. The cries of Janissaries echoed still, unbroken, relentless, their rhythm like heartbeat of empire. The defenders answered with shouts ragged, fierce, their voices raw with defiance. For every foot lost, they struck back. For every man fallen, another stepped forth. The city below trembled with sound. Families huddled in darkness, listening to roar upon walls, whispering prayers, clutching children close. In Hagia Sophia, hymns rose louder, candles flared brighter, voices lifted higher, striving to match the storm beyond. And upon ramparts, where blood slicked stone, where banners tore in wind, the struggle raged on Janissaries, crying out for conquest. Byzantines and Genoese answering with desperate courage. It was storm against cliff, tide against rock, destiny against defiance. Night crept nearer, but still the cries rang, filling air, shaking hearts, proclaiming that empire trembled and would not stand forever. The cry of the Janissaries was voice of new age, relentless, merciless, unceasing. And against it, the last defenders of Byzantium fought as men who knew they could not win, but could still defy. As the clash on the walls roared into dusk, another cry rose from the water. Goldenhorn, where the sea met the city's breath, smoke began to coil upward, black against crimson sky. It was the harbor, lifeblood of Constantinople, now turned battlefield. The iron chain that stretched across the mouth of the horn still held, its massive links glinting faintly in dying light. Behind it floated the Genoese and Byzantine ships too. Few, too weary, their sails ragged, their hulls patched with timbers. They had held back the Ottoman fleet for weeks, turning aside fire ships, boarding raiders, and hurling stones from mangonels bolted to decks. Yet on this evening, the enemy came with fury new, their ships moving in dark phalanx across water. Ottoman galleys pressed forward, their oars flashing, their hulls creaking, their decks swarming with archers and soldiers. But upon their prows torches flared, flames licking upward. Firepots were hurled, their clay shells bursting against sides of Christian ships, spilling pitch and oil that caught in sparks. Soon the water itself burned, flames spreading across waves, licking at timbers. Turning sea into mirror of hell, the defenders upon the walls near harbor looked down and wept. For below them, the city's last fleet groaned under weight of fire. Men cried out as sails caught, as decks smoked, as masts toppled. Archers loosed arrows that hissed through dusk, some striking, some lost in smoke. The sea echoed with shrieks of wounded, with crash of timber, with hiss of fire upon water. One Genoese ship, battered yet proud, rammed into enemy galley. The crash sent both vessels shuddering, men tumbling into sea. Upon decks, steel clashed. Cries rose. The Genoese captain, his face blackened with soot, swung his sword until flames consumed mast above him. With roar, the timber crashed down, sparks exploding, and sea swallowed ship and men alike. Their cries faded into steam and silence. Along quays, fires spread. Granaries caught, their stores of wheat bursting into flame. Smoke billowed, rolling into city, choking alleys already heavy with dust of fallen walls. Women screamed as sparks leaped across roofs, flames racing along timbers dried by weeks of sun. Buckets were formed, chains of hands passing water, but the fire leaped faster than men could fight. Soon, whole rows of houses near harbor burned, their light blazing upon dark water. Their collapse echoing like drums of doom. The Ottomans cheered from their ships, their voices carrying across waves. They hurled more firepots, more arrows, more curses. The Christians answered with stones, with bolts, with cries of prayer. But fire was enemy none could slay. It consumed without mercy, devouring wood, devouring sails, devouring men who leaped into sea, only to burn upon water. From the palace, Constantine gazed upon harbor aflame. His face was shadowed, his eyes hollow. He whispered, "The sea itself turns against us." Yet he did not falter. He ordered men to quays to fight flames to rescue what ships remained. He knew without harbor city was tomb already sealed in. Hagia Sophia, the faithful, saw a light of fire through high windows. They thought it sunrise, but when they learned truth, they wept. The choir sang louder, voices trembling, hymns shaking with sorrow. They sang to drown sound of flames, to silence screams carried by wind. To remind themselves that beyond fire there was still heaven, the children cried at sight of burning ships. They clutched mothers, asking if sea itself had turned to fire. If world would end in flame, mothers hushed them, though their own tears fell, for they could not answer. In their hearts they feared, children spoke truth that end had indeed come, not with flood as in days of Noah, but with fire upon water. The night deepened, and the harbor burned still. Ships cracked and sank, quays smoldered, smoke veiled stars. The water reflected flame until it seemed sea itself was molten. The air was heavy with ash, with salt, with cries of dying. Constantinople's lungs choked. Its breath faltered, and in the eyes of those who watched from walls, the fires of the harbor were more than flames. They were omen, herald of doom, sign that even sea had abandoned city. For if water could burn, then what hope could stone hold? Thus the harbor, once gate of empire, became pyre of its end. The fires of the harbor still glowed in distance, painting the sky above Golden Horn in streaks of orange and black. The air within the city stank of ash, salt, and smoke. Through alleys and courtyards, men and women whispered of doom, their voices trembling. Upon the walls, the defenders still fought. But inside the Blashany palace, the torches burned low, and within a high chamber, the last council of Byzantium gathered. The chamber was vast but hollow. Tapestries once embroidered with scenes of conquest now hung in tatters. Mephiton, their colors faded. The marble floor, polished by centuries of emperors and courtiers, was now cracked by tremors of cannon fire. Above, the ceiling groaned faintly with each distant blast, as though stone itself shuddered at weight of destiny. At the center stood Constantine XI. His armor dulled, his cloak torn, but his bearing unbroken. His face was pale, his beard streaked with dust, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness, yet within them burned light neither fear nor despair could quench. Around him gathered the few who still bore authority in a city that had already fallen in all but name. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, commander of the Genoese mercenaries, Lucas Notaris, the Grand Admiral, monks and priests from Hagia Sophia. A handful of generals whose armor bore more cracks than shine, they stood in silence at first. Each man listening to roar outside, each man unwilling to speak the words all knew. The council had been called not to plan salvation, for none believed. Salvation would come, but to speak of end, to choose how last hours would be faced. Constantine broke silence. His voice was calm, though heavy. "Brothers," he said, "the walls bleed, the harbor burns, the people suffer. Our numbers are too few, our strength spent, yet I will not speak of surrender." His eyes swept a chamber, steady and unyielding. "This city was given to us by Constantine the Great. For more than 1,000 years it has stood as shield of Christendom. If it must fall, let it fall in honor, not in chains." Giustiniani stepped forward, his face shadowed by fatigue, his arm bound from wound received upon wall. He bowed slightly. "We have fought with you, Basileus, and we will fight until last. Stone falls. My Genoese will not abandon the breach, though many already lie upon it. But I beg you, guard your life. The empire dies if you fall. If there is any chance to preserve your blood," the emperor raised his hand, silencing him. "My blood is no greater than yours, nor than any who fights upon wall. If city falls, I fall with it.
Ow.
No man will say the last emperor fled while his people died." A murmur-filled chamber, half sorrow, half admiration. The priests bowed there, heads, tears glinting in candlelight. Notaras' grave admiral lifted his voice, bitter yet resigned. "Better to see the city turned into Turkish turban than Latin mitre," he muttered, echoing words he had spoken before. Yet now, even his cynicism carried no weight, for he knew both were gone. No mitre, no turban, only smoke, only ash. The emperor spoke again. Tomorrow may be our last dawn. Tonight, therefore, I ask you to prepare your souls. Go to the churches, confess your sins, take the holy sacrament. Let us meet death as men purified, not afraid. And when dawn comes, stand upon wall, fight. As long as breath remains, this is our inheritance, this is our fate. Tears welled in eyes of soldiers hardened by years of war. Some fell to knees, crossing themselves. Priests lifted voices in psalms, soft but steady. Justiniani gripped, hilt of his sword, bowing his head. Constantine placed his hand upon his shoulder, then upon shoulder of each man present, blessing them with silence deeper than words. The council ended not with decree, but with prayer. They knelt together upon cracked marble, emperor among them. Heads bowed, lips moving in psalms, their voices mingled, rising into rafters, joining thunder of cannons outside, joining roar of fire from harbor. For a moment, chamber held two worlds, the world of steel and smoke, and the world of faith and memory. When they arose, each man knew he would not see another council, nor another dawn beyond tomorrow. But they walked from chamber with backs straight, their steps firm, for emperor had given them not hope but honor, and that was enough. Constantine lingered last, gazing long upon icons that still adorned cracked walls. He touched one the face of Christ Pantocrator, its paint faded but its gaze eternal.
Hey!
Into your hands, he whispered. Then he turned, walked into night, his shadow falling long across the floor of palace that would soon know silence eternal, and thus ended the last council of Byzantium. Not with promise of victory, but with vow of defiance, carried on lips of men who knew they walked into death. The night had not yet fallen, but already the city bled. It bled from its walls, from its streets, from its people. The stones themselves seemed soaked with crimson, as if they drank the sorrow of Byzantium. From the breaches came the wounded, stumbling, crawling, borne upon stretchers of broken planks. Their cries filled the air, sharp and endless. Some had arms dangling useless, some clutched bellies torn open, their entrails glistening in torchlight. Blood dripped from stairways, streaked across cobbles, gathered in gutters that once carried rain.
Ow.
Women rushed to meet them, tearing garments to bind wounds, pressing cloth against spurting arteries, whispering prayers through sobs. Children carried jars of water, staggering under weight, their faces pale with terror, their lips trembling in narrow alleys. Families ran, carrying bundles hastily gathered. Icons spread a few coins, scraps of clothing. They fled not from city, for there was nowhere to flee, but from houses crumbling under cannon fire, from streets swallowed by flame. Mothers clutched infants, their breasts dry of milk. Fathers led sons by hand, their eyes darting with panic, their shoulders stooped by weight of despair. The city had become a labyrinth of fear, every corner echoing with screams, every shadow hiding death. Fires spread beyond harbor, leaping from roof to roof, sparks carried by wind. Whole quarters burned, their timbers crackling, their windows belching smoke. The night sky glowed red as furnace, shadows dancing madly upon domes and towers. People formed chains with buckets, passing water from wells, but the fire laughed, devouring timbers faster than hands could quench. Some houses collapsed inward with roar, sending showers of sparks upward. Within, families were buried alive, their cries silenced beneath rubble. Bodies lay in streets, too many to bury, too many to mourn. Some were shrouded hastily, laid at church doors where priests prayed over them. Others were left where they had fallen, flies buzzing, dogs sniffing. A woman knelt over the body of her husband, rocking back and forth, her hands tangled in his bloodied hair. She wailed until her voice broke, then sat in silence, her eyes empty. Her lips still moving in prayer, no longer heard. The blood of the city seeped into its heart. Hagia Sophia trembled with hymns, louder, fiercer, more desperate, faithful. Sang not with hope of deliverance, but with plea for mercy. Their voices cracked, their tears flowed, their arms lifted toward dome, vast and high. Priests lifted chalice, gave sacrament to thousands kneeling, each mouth tasting bread and wine as Last Supper before end. The echo of hymns rolled outward, mingling with screams from streets, with roar of fire, with thunder of cannons, weaving sorrow into tapestry too vast for words on the walls. Defenders still fought, their hands raw, their bodies broken. They hurled stones with arms trembling, they thrust spears with strength fading, they prayed with lips bleeding. But for each man fallen, fewer rose. The breaches widened, the ladders multiplied, the blood ran thicker. Men slipped upon parapets, slick with gore, their cries lost in clash of steel. The walls themselves seemed to groan, as if weary of holding. Children's games in alleys turned grim. No longer did they pretend to topple walls with sticks. Now they huddled in silence, listening to thunder above. Some mimicked prayers of parents, their small hands clasped, their voices high and broken. Others clung to mothers, asking when it would end, asking if angels would come. The mothers kissed their brows, whispered lies wrapped in love. Tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow the saints will save us. But their eyes betrayed truth. There would be no tomorrow, not as children hoped. Blood stained every corner upon walls, upon streets, upon robes of priests, upon hands of mothers, upon toys of children, stripped from swords, from wounds, from hearts broken beyond healing. The city bled as man bled, its lifeblood seeping out drop by drop, breath by breath, and still the drums beat beyond walls, still the cannons roared, still the enemy surged. The city staggered, bleeding, burning, weeping, yet it lived still, clinging with nails broken, with faith cracked, with courage shattered but unyielding. The sun fell at last, swallowed by smoke, by fire, by sorrow. Night came, but it was no longer dark, for the city itself burned, its blood and its flames painting sky in red eternal. Thus Constantinople bled, its wounds too deep, its cries too many, its strength too frail. Yet in its bleeding, it endured still, for it had not yet fallen. And in its defiance, it lived one breath longer. Night had fallen heavy upon Constantinople. The fires of the harbor still glowed, the breaches in the walls still smoldered, and the cries of wounded still rose from every alley. Yet through the smoke, through the fear, through the endless roar of cannon and drum, there came another sound, sounder, like a river flowing through darkness. The liturgy of Hagia Sophia. The great church, crown of the city, had stood for 1,000 years. Its dome rose vast above rooftops, shimmering faintly with gold tiles even beneath shroud of smoke. Tonight it shone like final star of empire, a beacon drawing the people of Constantinople to its heart. From every quarter they came soldiers, leaving the walls for a brief hour, women carrying infants, old men hobbling on staffs, children clinging to mothers' hands. They came barefoot, dusty, bleeding, carrying icons, carrying nothing but tears. They filled the streets, moving in silence toward the church, as if drawn by invisible hand. Inside, the nave blazed with candles. Thousands of flames trembled in air heavy with incense, their light gilding mosaics of Christ, of Virgin, of saints. Shadows danced upon marble pillars, upon faces pale and gaunt, upon eyes hollow yet shining with tears. The church was full beyond measure, men pressed shoulder to shoulder. Women knelt in aisles, children perched upon steps, priests crowded near altar. The dome itself seemed to echo with heartbeats, with whispers, with sobs. At the altar, priests. In vestments faded by time-lifted chalices, their hands shaking yet steady. The patriarch, old and frail, his beard white as ash, raised the cross high. His voice trembled at first, then grew strong. Kyrie eleison. Lord have mercy, the crowd answered. Lord have mercy. Their voices rolling like wave through. Now vast. Tears streamed down faces, sobs broke into hymns, prayers rose like smoke. Filling space between earth and dome, the emperor himself entered, his armor dusted with blood, his cloak torn. He removed his helm, bowed low, and walked barefoot down aisle. The people parted before him, many reaching to touch his cloak, his hands, even his armor. He knelt before an altar, pressing his forehead to stone worn smooth by centuries. His lips moved, words silent but known, a confession, a surrender, a plea for strength. When he arose, his eyes glistened, yet his face was steady. Communion was given. One by one, thousands approached altar. Bread was placed upon tongues trembling. Wine touched lips cracked with thirst. Soldiers wept as they knelt, their swords clattering. Upon stone, women sobbed as they received, their children clutching their skirts. Old men smiled faintly, whispering psalms as they took last sacrament of lives long spent. The emperor received with them, no crown upon his brow. No throne beneath him, only bread, only wine, only God. And then the hymns rose. From galleries above, monks lifted voices, their chants deep, solemn, echoing across dome. The people joined, their voices breaking, trembling, yet filling air with sound more powerful than drums of enemy. They sang not of victory but of faith, not of triumph but of surrender, not of empire but of eternity. Their voices mingled with sobs, with prayers, with whispers, until Hagia Sophia trembled with sorrow and with hope. Outside the cannons roared, the drums thundered, the horns cried. But within the church, the voices of thousands rose higher, filling heavens with plea. Christ have mercy. Lord have mercy. Into your hands we commend our spirits. Children slept upon laps of mothers, their faces peaceful for first time in days. Old men smiled as if already glimpsing another world. Soldiers clasped hands, their eyes lifted, their hearts steady for what dawn would bring. And the emperor stood among them, not above but with them, his shadow blending with theirs, his fate bound to theirs. At last the patriarch raised his arms, blessing all. Go now, my children. Tomorrow we meet our Lord. Fight with courage, pray with faith, die with honor. The people wept, but they wept with strength. They left church in silence, carrying candle flames into dark streets, their light trembling like stars fallen to earth. Hagia Sophia's doors closed, its dome still glowing, its chants still echoing, and thus the last liturgy of Byzantium was sung, not in triumph, not in joy, but in sorrow and in faith. It was farewell to city, to empire, to 1,000 years. Yet it was also promised that though stone might fall, though walls might crumble, though empire might die, the soul of people would not vanish, for it had been offered to heaven in him. In prayer, in tears, outside the night deepened. Fires burned, drums thundered, cannons roared. But within hearts of those who had knelt in Hagia Sophia, there lingered still the echo of that final song. And in that echo, Constantinople lived one moment longer. The liturgy had ended. The candles of Hagia Sophia guttered, their smoke rising, like souls into the vast dome. Outside, the night pressed heavy, carrying with it the smell of ash, of sweat, of iron. The people dispersed in silence, clutching their children, their icons, their faith. In their hearts, they knew the morning would bring the end, and the morning came. Pale, gray, heavy. The first light revealed walls trembling, towers cracked, gates splintered. The cannons had done their work. The city was not fortress but corpse, bleeding from wounds too many to mend. And then, as sun broke faintly upon horizon, the Sultan gave the signal. Drums thundered, horns screamed. The cry of Janissaries rose again, a roar vast and terrible, rolling across plain and into city. Thousands surged forward, their ladders raised, their shields lifted, their blades gleaming. The bombards bellowed one last time, stones shrieking. Through air striking the gate of St. Romanus, with roar like thunder and mountain breaking, the masonry exploded outward. Dust and smoke billowed, cries rose from walls, and there yawned a breach wide enough for empire to die. Through it poured the flood. Janissaries charged, their formation tight, their cries unbroken. Behind them came waves of warriors, Turks, Arabs, Persians, Slavs, multitudes bound by hunger for city, by will of Sultan. They surged like river through broken dam, unstoppable, merciless. Upon the breach the defenders braced. Constantine himself stood there, his sword lifted, his eyes blazing. Around him gathered the remnants of garrison Greeks gaunt with hunger, Genoese scarred with wounds, priests clutching crosses in one hand and swords in the other. They knew they could not hold, but they stood. The clash was fury. Rang. On steel, shields splintered, men screamed. The Janissaries pressed in, their blades flashing. Defenders struck back with spears, with stones, with fury of despair. Blood-spattered stone, bodies fell, cries rose. Justiniani fought at Constantine's side, his great frame cleaving foes. Arrows struck his arm, his chest, his side. Yet he fought on, his sword flashing until at last he staggered, bleeding, carried from breach by his men. His fall broke hearts, but Constantine's cry rose above. Stand! Stand for the city! The defenders fought as lions cornered. They hurled themselves against tide, their swords crimson, their hands raw. Priests blessed as they struck, their lips still whispering psalms. Boys scarcely grown to manhood lifted spears, stabbing, weeping, praying in same breath. Women rushed with buckets of stones, with jars of oil, hurling them upon invaders. The breach became furnace, flames of faith and fury burning in dust and smoke, but still the tide pressed. More ladders rose, more soldiers climbed, more arrows fell. The drums pounded, the horns blared, the cries of Allahu Akbar rolled unceasing. The defenders were few, their arms weary, their strength fading. One by one they fell, their blood soaking into rubble. Yet still they fought, still they cried, still they stood. Constantine struck again and again, his sword gleaming, his cloak torn, his body bleeding. His guards fell beside him, his friends lay dead at his feet, yet he did not falter. His cry echoed across breach. The city is fallen, but I live still. His men roared in answer, their courage fierce even as death. Closed, the sun climbed higher, its light glinting upon helmets, upon swords, upon blood. The breach widened with every heartbeat, swallowing defenders, pouring invaders into city. The walls that had held 1,000 years cracked at last, their stones broken, their spirits shattered. The breach was no longer wound, it was mouth. And through it poured the death of Byzantium. The breach yawned wide. Smoke and dust swirled, torches flickered, steel clashed upon steel. Screams rang out, voices of men dying, voices of men killing, voices of men who knew their world was ending. And at the heart of it, amidst rubble and ruin, stood Constantine Palaiologos, last emperor of Rome. His armor was dented, his cloak torn to ribbons, his helm lost somewhere in the melee. Blood streaked his face, some his own, some of others. His sword was crimson, his shield shattered, yet his eyes burned with fire, unquenched. He no longer bore the weight of empire, nor of crown, nor of throne, bore only duty, stripped to its core, to fight, to stand, to die as emperor among his people. Around him, his guard fell one by one. The Varangians, descendants of Northmen, sworn to protect thrones, stood as walls of flesh. They swung axes until arms failed, their cries fierce, their bodies broken. Priests, robes dark with blood, fought with crosses in one hand and swords in the other, chanting psalms between blows. Genoese mercenaries, their commander wounded and gone, still struck as if vengeance itself wielded their blades. And ordinary men craftsmen, farmers, youths fought beside them, their faces pale, their courage desperate, their souls blazing brighter in last moments than in all their lives. The Janissaries pressed close, their formation unbroken, their cries unyielding. Blades flashed, shields locked, their chant rose like storm. Allahu Akbar, they cried, their voices deafening. Step by step, they drove defenders back. Step by step, they claimed breach. Yet at its heart, Constantine stood, unmovable, unbroken. He struck one Janissary, his sword cleaving helm. He wheeled, cutting down another. He roared like lion cornered, his voice carrying above thunder. "Is there no Christian left to fight with me?" he cried. Men answered, their voices hoarse, their courage burning. They rallied to him, striking harder, their blood flowing freely. For in sight of emperor who refused to yield, no man could flee. But numbers pressed. Arrows flew, striking armor, biting flesh. Spears thrust, blades swung. Constantine staggered, blood spilling from wound inside, yet he struck still. Another blow tore across his arm, yet he lifted sword with other. It was no longer man, but spirit, fury, defiance incarnate. And then, at last, he fell, surrounded, struck from many sides, his sword shattered, his body pierced. He sank to knees, his blood soaking rubble, his breath leaving in gasp. Yet his lips still moved, whispering prayer, whispering vow, Lord, into your hands. His eyes closed, his head bowed. The emperor of 1,000 years, last of Rome's line, lay still. For a heartbeat, battle hushed. Even Janissaries paused, gazing upon body of man who had fought as lion. Then roar rose anew, drowning silence, drowning sorrow. They surged forward, over rubble, over bodies, over emperor himself. The defenders saw, and grief became fury. They fought like madmen, heedless of wounds, heedless of death. Some threw themselves upon invaders, dragging them down, biting, clawing, striking with bare hands. Priests screamed psalms until throats tore, swinging blades until cut down. Joined hurling stones, shrieking curses. Children threw sticks, their cries high and desperate. The city itself seemed to convulse, every soul striking one last time. But it could not hold. The emperor was dead, the breach unsealed, the tide unstoppable. One by one defenders fell, their blood mingling with his. The cries of Janissaries echoed, their banners rose, their blades shone in light of burning city and upon rubble.
Out.
Among dead lay Constantine Palaiologos. No crown upon his brow, no throne beneath him, only dust, only blood, only honor. He died as emperor, he died as soldier, he died as man who refused to flee. His name became prayer upon lips of those who lived a heartbeat longer. His memory became shield even as city fell. Thus ended the last emperor of Byzantium, not in palace, not in church, but in breach, sword in hand, blood upon stone. And with him ended empire of 1,000 years, but his death was not silence. It was cry carried, by wind, by sea, by history itself, that Rome had died standing, not kneeling. The emperor had fallen. His body lay among rubble and warriors, his blood mingling with dust of the broken gate. Upon the walls the banner of the crescent rose, fluttering against smoke-filled sky. The roar of Janissaries carried across city like storm unchained, and with it the soul of Byzantium broke. Yet even as steel flooded the streets, thousands fled not to arms, but to sanctuary. They fled to Hagia Sophia. From every alley they poured men, women, children, the old, the lame. They carried nothing but icons, candles, scraps of bread, the last fragments of lives shattered.
Nice.
They streamed through streets choked with smoke, stumbling past corpses, past burning houses, past walls trembling with thunder. Their cries filled air, to the great church, to the house of God. There we will be safe. Hagia Sophia's doors loomed vast and open, the bronze worn smooth by centuries of hands. Within, the nave glowed with thousands of candles, their flames trembling like stars caught in storm. The mosaics gleamed faintly through haze, Christ Pantocrator, gazing down with eyes solemn, the Virgin spreading her arms, saints bending in, blessing, the vast dome soared above, echoing with psalms, with sobs, with prayers. The patriarch and priests led liturgy still, though their voices shook with fear. Kyrie eleison, they sang, Lord have mercy. The people answered, there. Voices aflood, echoing against marble pillars, rising into dome. Some fell to knees, clutching children, pressing foreheads to stone. Others lifted icons high, their eyes streaming, their lips moving in prayer unbroken. Women wailed, old men wept, children sobbed. The air was thick with incense and terror. The doors were barred, heavy timbers were dragged across, iron bolts thrust into place. Men piled benches, stones, whatever they could find. Here we are safe, they whispered. Here God will protect us. No enemy will dare profane the holy church. They clung to hope, desperate, as drowning men cling to driftwood. Outside, the roar grew louder. The streets trembled with boots, with hooves, with clash of steel. Shouts rang, horns blared, drums thundered. The tide surged closer, wave of iron, and fire pressing upon church. The defenders at doors braced, their hands white upon beams, their hearts hammering. Then the crash came. Axes struck bronze, hammers pounded wood, iron bit into hinges. The doors shuddered, groaned. Inside, the people shrieked, clutched children tighter, pressed icons to lips. Priests lifted crosses, chanting louder, voices desperate, "Christ have mercy, Lord deliver us." The dome shook with their cries, with thunder at doors, with rumble of fate. Again the crash, louder, fiercer. Bronze dented, timbers split, bolts groaned. Dust rained from ceiling, candles guttered. Children screamed, mothers wept, men shouted, prayers drowned by thunder. The great church trembled as though heaven itself shook, and then silence. A breath, a pause, a heartbeat. The people froze, lips parted, hearts still. For an instant, hope flickered. Perhaps the enemy had turned, perhaps miracle had come. But hope died as thunder roared once more, greater than before. The doors burst inward, timbers splintering, bronze crashing, iron shrieking, and through the breach poured the tide. Janissaries surged, their blades flashing, their cries shattering air. Allahu Akbar. They roared, voices deafening, echoing through dome. Their boots struck marble, their swords cut air, their shields gleamed in candlelight. They filled nave, aisles, galleries, a flood unstoppable. The people shrieked, their cries rising, filling dome with cacophony of terror. Some clutched altar, some clung to pillars, some threw themselves upon floor, pressing foreheads to stone. Priests raised crosses, chanting still. One was cut down where he stood, his blood spilling upon steps of altar. Another clutched gospel to chest, struck through by blade. Icons fell, candles toppled, hymns broke into screams. The dome, once echo of faith, became chamber of slaughter. Women were dragged, children torn from arms, men struck down, the air filled with sobs, with steel, with prayers broken. The great church became not sanctuary but tomb, its marble stained crimson, its mosaics veiled in smoke, and high above, upon dome vast, Christ Pantocrator gazed still. His eyes solemn, his face sorrowful, bearing witness to end. Thus Hagia Sophia fell, not with crumbling of stone, but with shattering of faith, with cries of thousands drowned in roar of conquest, and with it the heart of Byzantium died. The sun had long since died into smoke, and night came heavy upon the city. But it was not a night of silence, nor of rest. It was a night of fire. From the breaches in the walls to the domes of Hagia Sophia, Constantinople burned. Flames leapt high into sky, consuming houses, palaces, markets. Sparks flew like stars, carried upon wind to roofs, waiting to ignite. Air roared with fire, hissed with collapsing beams, screamed with voices of people fleeing, of children crying, of women wailing. The city that had once been called the Queen of Cities was now a pyre of its own glory. The conquerors surged through streets, their cries filling alleys. The Janissaries marched in ranks still disciplined, but behind them came tideless ordered warriors hungry for plunder. Doors were smashed, chests pried open, coins clattered to ground, silks torn from walls. The treasures of 1,000 years spilled into dust. Icons were shattered, chalices seized, holy relics scattered. Gold was heavy in hands, but blood was heavier upon blades. The people suffered. Some were cut down where they stood, others dragged screaming into night. Mothers clutched infants only to have them torn away. Old men knelt, praying until swords silenced them. Children wept, their small voices lost in chaos. The city bled, not only from walls and stones, but from every soul within. In Hagia Sophia, the dome echoed with weeping still, but now it was weeping of captives. The great church, once heart of Christendom, had become trophy of conquest. Its mosaics were veiled in smoke, its marbles slick with blood, its altar profaned. The conquerors stood within, raising banners, their cries of triumph filling sacred space. The faithful knelt still, some praying, some silent in shock, their voices drowned. The great dome, which had once echoed with hymns, now carried sound of chains, of steel, of conquest. The emperor lay dead at the breach, his body unmarked by crown, unknown among fallen. Some say he was buried beneath rubble, others that he vanished carried into legend. But the truth mattered little, for with his death ended the line of Constantine, and with him ended empire that had stood 1,000 years. Yet even as city fell, even as night consumed it, something lingered. It's the memory of its glory, of its faith, of its endurance, rose like ghost above flames. The dome still gleamed faintly through smoke, the walls still stood though broken, the sea still lapped at shores. And in hearts of survivors, in voices carried into exile, Constantinople lived. The moon rose, pale and cold, shining upon city broken. Its light-touched towers shattered, palaces burned, streets strewn with corpses. It gleamed upon helmets of conquerors, upon chains of captives, upon domes blackened by fire. Yet it also gleamed upon waters of Bosphorus, eternal, upon sky vast and endless, upon stars that watched indifferent. And so night fell fully over Byzantium, a night not of ours but of centuries. For empire was ended, its crown taken, its city consumed, but in fall of Constantinople lay seed of memory, of legend. Sorrow told in whispers through ages. Thus ended the last day of Byzantium. The city bled. The city burned. The city died. But the spirit of Constantinople lives still, in memory, in prayer, in echo of hymns once sung beneath dome vast. And though night covered it, the world would not forget, for once it had been the queen of cities. And even in death, it remained eternal.